Trail and Ultrarunners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this week I'm out on the road again. I'm recording this out of my hotel room. I brought on the podcast this week somebody who I have a tremendous amount of respect for in the research and the coaching community, and that is Jamie Pugh, PhD, who is a researcher at John Moores University. He is also an athlete, and he's also a fantastic coach. And he just happens to have a specialty in GI function and GI distress. And I don't need to tell you athletes out there that that is one of the most prevalent problems in all of endurance sports, and in particular with the rigors of ultramarathon running. It's something that everybody experiences. Jamie was recently a co-author on a paper that was titled Gastrointestinal Pathophysiology During Endurance Exercise, Endocrine, Microbiome, and Nutritional Influences. And if you can't tell from the title of that paper, we need to think about GI distress as this multifactorial problem that has different answers that you can use to reduce the severity and the symptoms of GI distress. We go through a whole host of those during the course of this podcast, as well as some practical implementations that you can use during training and during races. I really appreciate Jamie coming on the podcast, and as an extra special treat for the listeners, we're going to have the lead author, Kyle Smith, of this paper come on next week in a special 2-part series. So I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Jamie Pugh. You're doing the study at Kona, and you reached out to me to see if we had any athletes there. How has that generally been going for you guys? Are you guys going to get it up and running? Are you going to have a good subject pool?
It looks, yeah. I think we've got just over 40 now. I think in the last maybe in the last 10 days of recruitment, I think we'll get another 10 more at least. So it's been amazing. Like, look, the study isn't directly in conjunction with Ironman or anything. That we're not officially affiliated with the race, so that's always makes things more difficult because you're trying to indirectly contact potential participants. So we knew it was going to be a challenge, but yeah, it's going to make, because ultra endurance athletes are amazing at this sort of thing, and they're more than happy to get involved, and they're interested in data, they're interested in themselves, they're inquisitive. So when you put the study to them, our hit rate has been really good. Like, most people that hear about it have said yes, but it's just that challenge in the first place. But it's going amazing. The biggest challenge now is getting me into Hawaii for the study, obviously based here in the UK. What I might have to do is go and spend 2 weeks in South America somewhere first, somewhere that is letting the Brits in, go stay there for 2 weeks, and then fly directly from there to Hawaii.
Oh my God, I didn't think about that. Wow. It just makes everything more complicated. Is there anybody else on the research team that needs to come from outside the US?
No. So everyone else is basically
Oh, wow.
based in the US. It means that we've been hit on numbers slightly as well, because I know so many Brits and so many Europeans who've got their place, who've got their slot. They've maybe entered, or they've maybe booked the flights and a credit card, but while they don't know what's going to happen with the restrictions, it's like, well, I don't even know if I'm going to race. I've entered, but I don't know if I can get there, which is crazy that we're only, I think, what, six and a bit weeks away, 7 weeks away.
Yeah. Wow. Unbelievable. Well, good luck with it.
No,
That's a,
even with what we've got now, it's going to be an unbelievable study, like something that shows the power of things like this, because it all happened from a podcast. Like, Greg and Matt were on another podcast. I don't know if I should say the podcast, because obviously it's another ultra endurance one.
that's totally fine. You can say it's totally fine.
No, but they were on the Ian Sharman podcast discussing research and discussing GI issues. And then out of the blue, one of them just goes, "Oh, and there was this really cool study from the UK in Liverpool," and I was just listening to it. And so I reached out to them, and that was the start of this whole study. So it shows, even from an academic side of things, the usefulness of conversations like this and the reach it can have.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that COVID has kind of done is it's forced us to network differently, right? And part of that different in network is getting on podcasts and having conference calls and doing these like kind of seminars and stuff like that. And it's fostered some different ways of thinking in my perspective.
No, 100%. That makes sense. Some for the better, some maybe not for the better if we can try and blend the two, because it is still nice to meet people face to face and chat, but maybe just cut some of the unnecessary ones where we're flying around the world doing conferences or meetings.
Yeah, I've definitely been on my fair share of unnecessary flights. Okay, well, good luck to you in that study. I hope that it
Thank
comes
you
back.
so
We'll bring you back on the podcast to discuss the results. How's that sound?
Definitely. I think the results would be amazing. I said Greg has already done a case study with one of the guys who ran Western States a few years ago, and if we see something similar but in a large group of athletes, then it'll be an amazing data set.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so what we're going to discuss is another paper, though, and to cue the listeners up, the title of it. First off, it's in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. And the title is Gastrointestinal Pathophysiology During Endurance Exercise, Endocrine, Microbiome, and Nutritional Influences. And whenever I see a title like this, I'm kind of laughing. I feel that the research team, and in particular the lead author and the second authors that have kind of like brought this to light, whenever I see a title like this, the only thing I can think is okay, there's this big issue out there and they're just trying to figure all this shit out. They're just trying to figure it out with the rest of us using the existing research because it's such a big, comprehensive topic. So let's take the broadest look possible at all of the existing research and try to distill it down into some common themes. So am I correct in that assertion that you and Kyle, who's the lead author, are kind of looking at this and going, okay, let's see if we can figure some of this stuff out?
100%. Like you said, we almost start with that basic idea of that there's so much research now. When I started my PhD about 6 years ago, and I think that some of this stuff is starting to be published. I think maybe going back to 2010, around that sort of time, the papers have started to gather in this area of endurance exercise or ultra endurance exercise and gastrointestinal issues, and it just snowballs every year. And so Kyle and Michael Ormsby, who's a corresponding author on the paper, approached myself and then Graham Close, who's my line manager at Liverpool John Moores University. And because we published some papers in this area, they published some papers in this area. So, okay, let's bring together some of the current information. So we didn't really start with all of those different topics in mind. But as you said, what naturally happens is you think, well, we can't really only talk about this while ignoring another huge factor that could play into it, because you either make ourselves look stupid or, you're ignoring something blatant. And then part of the reason we want to bring so many is to make our review a little bit different, is to include some of those topics, even though there's no research in them, with the hope that, okay, if we just start to bring this to light and we start the conversation, then rather than rehash the same studies over and over again, which is, I think, is definitely what has happened in the last couple of years. I see so many papers that measure the same blood marker or the same two blood markers, and I think we've hit a stalling point in our knowledge. So it's okay, what about all of these other things that no one has started to study yet? And that's some of those things that I'm sure we'll get into.
And so the gist of the whole thing is it's multifactorial, right? We tend to try to, in the ultra endurance and the endurance space, we tend to try to look at gastrointestinal distress, which is a big deal. It's always been a big deal, and it continues to be a big deal. And I think that this in injuries are probably the front runners in terms of the things that we have not figured out very well as endurance athletes. And one of the things I've kind of like come to appreciate with actually both of those topics, now that I'm thinking about it, is that there are always a multitude of factors that are going into it. And what I felt that you guys were trying to do is almost kind of rank order it a little bit. Like, here are the heavy hitters that are the most important, that are causing the issue, and here are the heavy hitters that you can focus on to try to alleviate it. So we'll take the first topic first, right? The heavy hitters that are actually causing this issue. So when you go and you look at the landscape of things, what are the major contributing factors to all this GI distress? And I think that this order is important because the solutions have to fit the problems, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of that linkage kind of came out throughout the paper. So why don't you set that table for us really quick?
No, and that's a really good way of thinking about it. And there's even almost a differentiation between the causes that you can action upon and maybe some of the underlying physiology and mechanisms, which are sort of neat and interesting, but like you said, for a coach or an athlete, it's sort of, I don't really care what modifiable action can I take in the build up to my next race or in my next race. And that's where probably it all starts with the diet. And so I think one of the first things we said in there is that if one of the, if not the primary function of the gastrointestinal tract is to digest and absorb nutrients from our diet, and we know that it passes through and eventually it will come out the other side. And what we're trying to avoid is either unwanted movement, unwanted symptoms from movement, um, irregular movement or malabsorption of any of those foods, all of which can start to manifest in symptoms. Even what we put into our stomach. So when we look at some of the symptoms like nausea or vomiting, this can happen if we're putting too much of the wrong things in at the wrong time. And then if it can't go down, it's ultimately got to come back up at some point. And I think you're right. One of the, it's so much more prevalent in running, first of all, than any other sport. Running events are one of the few sports where you have regular non-finishes, non-completions, or postponements due to gastrointestinal symptoms. You rarely see it on a football pitch or in team sport, or even in cycling. It's so much rarer than it is in running at most distances. And then as you go up in the distances, it's more and more common. I think it's probably N-shaped. I think there's probably a distance or a duration where we have the highest incidence. So I don't know if that's maybe around the 100-mile, 24-hour mark. And I think potentially because that's the limit of we're still really running at a fast pace, especially at that elite end. They are running seriously fast. So it's a huge physiological challenge. They also then need to try and fuel that. And they also probably don't want any unexpected bathroom breaks during it. So I think that's why then if you have one, that is a major drawback against performance. If you're doing something longer than 24 hours, you probably plan to go to the toilet at some point or other. You probably plan to have a bowel movement. So you can factor it in and it's less of a psychological stress. So I think that, as I said, there's no great data. It's difficult to collect data, obviously, from a lot of these. But from what I've seen, that 100-mile, 24-hour, plus they're always ran in these amazing but hot places. There's often an altitude challenge to some of the big major races as well. So that you add that stress on top of it, and all of a sudden the digestive tract probably can't handle the huge amounts of food we're trying to get in to fuel that performance.
And so when we look at gastrointestinal distress through that like multifactorial lens and then specific for ultra runners, can we rack and stack what the root causes are? Meaning, or is it even possible? Meaning, you talked about earlier, modality matters, right? We see this in running a lot more than we see it in cycling or in other endurance sports. The sheer volume of food that you're taking in matters a lot.
And
The amount of,
the timing of that food as well. So
yeah,
instead, it probably starts 8 to 10 weeks out. Your risk is going to be changing that whole way through, because if you're not eating the types of foods that you're going to eat in the race, if you're not training the gut, if then in the 24 to 48 hours you're eating foods that are more likely to sit in the large intestine, so your fatty foods, your high fiber foods, that's going to cause an osmotic challenge. And then right the way through to the race, if you're eating the wrong sources of say carbohydrates, or the wrong types of foods that you haven't trained the gut to eat. So it's that whole way through. And I think that's, as you said, what makes it so difficult, because then when you get a study with 20 runners and you try and isolate one variable, but you haven't been able to factor all of these other variables. So even if you just you can look at the averages, certainly, and you can start to say, well, on average, these are the ones that mostly affect athletes or have some impact on our athletes. But you delve into it further, you see that at an individual level, none of them are great predictors. You probably do need an appreciation of all of it to try and isolate the one that's impacting you or your athlete.
yeah. So I think the better way to frame it up is to understand that there are all of these factors. And then as you're going through training and the racing process to kind of like solve this problem, pick the things that might actually have an impact across those factors versus just randomly kind of throwing
Yeah,
stuff across the wall, right?
yeah. No, definitely. Like I said, because you can start to think, even within, like I said, in ultra endurance races, how long is it? Will maybe even start to factor in. Will you consider solid foods, or will you take almost an entire liquid or gel form of carbohydrate intake? Do you need foods other than high carbohydrate foods? If it's that long, you might want a hot meal, you might want something. Um, we know that the longer the duration, the more our taste preferences flip a little bit, and we start desiring savory type foods, and all of that needs to go into the planning. Like you said, it's such a one of the reasons I think it's still quite prevalent is because it's almost such a big task. And when you're trying
Right.
to think about your training load and your travel arrangements and all of those other parts that come to race performance, to add that extra one in is difficult. And maybe it's the one that most people bring in at the final stage if they've got that time or mental capacity to consider it. Otherwise, it's all right, well, these are the general things that I know or that I've heard about fueling. I'll just stick with some of these general guidelines without thinking about the other
You just
10.
you just touched on a really important topic because most athletes are trying to solve these GI issues in real time.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is it's more likely that if you take a comprehensive approach throughout the training process, those things don't show up. And your paper identified 3 or 4 different things that can happen during both during, well, a little bit during the race, but mainly during the training process that could help alleviate GI symptoms. And let's start to run through those because this is going to be the solutions part of the part of the
Yeah, yeah,
podcast here. We'll just say the problem's super complicated. Here are the solutions. We'll skip we'll skip
yeah.
the first part. So the things that you identified are a low FODMAP diet, training the gut, which is kind of becoming a little bit controversial, if these things can be controversial, right? Can you actually achieve that adaptation? And probiotics. So let's run through those and why they actually might be efficacious in terms of creating a better GI scenario for race day.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. So the low FODMAP diet then, so anyone who hasn't maybe come across it, or if those have, it's about giving it too much of an in-depth rundown. We're looking at typically undigestible fibers or carbohydrates that will pass through the small intestine and then make their way through to the large intestine, and they're then fermented by the bacteria in our guts, which for most of us is something that's actually beneficial. We want in a lot of circumstances, depending on the type of fiber, or in some, they can have prebiotic effects, so they could be good for our gut health. The research has started to translate over because it's been found that in IBS patients, it can be an effective treatment for symptoms. Because what you're essentially doing, if you're taking away the food from that fiber, the food for that gut bacteria, when they consume that, they're giving off gas. And so that's going to cause an internal pressure in the abdomen or the intestines. They can also have an osmotic effect. So if those molecules are in the large intestine, they might be drawing water again into the intestines, causing like a hydro pressure, if you like. So that's where that idea has come from. And then the researchers have translated to that to say, okay, does this have an effect for those who suffer from symptoms during exercise? The efficacy of it is mixed. I think it's, again, if you look at so Dana Liz and Trent Stellenworth published an amazing paper a couple of years ago looking at symptomology in athletes. The problem that they found, and that I certainly found in some of my research, is that athletes do have symptoms from time to time, but in their general training, it's rare enough that it's difficult to measure. So in that paper, they have a really nice graph that shows that, okay, on a week, if we ask all these athletes to rate their symptoms on a visual scale, you have this huge range in their participants. So some of them have a really small amount of symptoms that week, which is sort of to be expected, isn't it? If all of us were always suffering from these symptoms, we would have given up the sport a long time ago. We wouldn't go out the door running if we were almost guaranteed a symptom. In that paper, they found that on average, the low FODMAPs reduced gastrointestinal symptoms. the magnitude of response though was really varied. Some had no response whatsoever. Some people reported worse symptoms on the low FODMAP. So it's one of those that, exactly like we started off saying, that it's not then just as simple as saying, oh, should we just go low FODMAP? Because they're beneficial to health in other ways, or certain high FODMAP foods, to then unnecessarily restrict could have a negative impact, especially if it's something that you bring into race day without having trialed it before. So it's become one of those it's almost not quite, but it's similar to like it's the new low gluten diet or gluten-free diet.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of endurance sport, it's become this really like popular thing. And of course, in some people, it can reduce their symptoms, but it's most of these foods, if they're high carbohydrate foods, they're going to be lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, lots of foods that we'd otherwise want to consume. So it's that's the first one. And so I think for some athletes, it's certainly worth a conversation. It's certainly worth a food diary before a race or before a key training run, and then you can start to track the symptoms. Because, like I said, there's been a few case studies that has been really effective with some athletes who consistently suffer with symptoms during races.
It's so the dialogue that you just mentioned mirrors my professional experience with this, because I have had athletes on both sides of the efficacy fence where we introduce a low FODMAP diet and it literally is miraculous. Like, I mean, it's just like it is. You're exactly right. It is just like the low gluten or gluten-free diet was, 7 or 8 years ago, where people were going on this and they were just like, kind of blown away with, or some people were just blown away with what the difference was. And then I've had other athletes that we try to incorporate it for whatever reason, and it's just like a big nothing burger, like
And
there's.
I was going to say, and that's where, not that it's dangerous is maybe the wrong word, but the gluten-free diet is restrictive. The low FODMAP diet is really restrictive because there are so many fruits, vegetables, dairy that you need to take out. And if you're going to do it for an IBS patient who would go on a low FODMAP diet, you would undergo this months-long process of eliminating all of them, then bringing one of them back in each time to try and, because it's likely that you're only one type of fermentable carbohydrate is the issue. You could probably digest all of the others, but one might give you the issue. So it might be lactose, for example, or it might be gluten, or whatever it's going to be. So that's the process you would undergo if you were diet. So just completely restrict it before your races. And if you're somebody who races 3, 4, 5 times a year, you could be doing this every couple of months, every few months.
Well, and another one of the big issues with trying to figure it out that way is just the total amount of energy availability that you're intaking typically goes down, because you're taking your normal diet and you're restricting something or some things from it. And most people have a challenging time replacing those calories one for one. And when the training load is really high, or even if the training load is not very high, it's very easy to come up with an energy mismatch. So it's not the way that the way that I've always viewed trying to incorporate or try to test out a low FODMAP diet is not simply by elimination, but by substitution. Because if you get that substitution piece in your head, you can kind of get the calories right, because here you can very easily just substitute one problem for another. Right. You substitute the GI issue, maybe you find some alleviation or some sort of fix for that. But on the other end of the spectrum, now you have an energy intake problem, which is, you could argue is even more problematic especially from a long-term perspective.
And that comes back to something that I meant to touch on early on, in saying that when we talk about gastrointestinal symptoms, one of the problems has become, and I've certainly experienced this with athletes that I've consulted for, is that any symptom is a problem. And the reality is it's not, is it? Like, so we could run and have a little bit of gas. It's uncomfortable, but so is running an ultramarathon. Like, it's uncomfortable on your feet, it's uncomfortable on your joints. And so they said, so I've definitely had athletes, and you ask them, oh, did it cause you to not finish the race? Did you have to drop out? And they turn around and say, oh no, it's just, I'd rather not have it. Or that's the impression that you get. And so if that's the level you're starting at to try and alleviate, and like you said, you could be throwing a much bigger problem on by a low energy availability or a restricted diet. it's obviously not worth it. So that was one of the things I wanted to say from the start as well, is that even the severity of symptoms needs to be considered, because a lot of the research, you see these big numbers thrown that 90% of athletes surveyed at Western States had a symptom. You go through the data and you find that, well, look, 60% of that 90 just farted, essentially. That was it. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, they reported 1 for flatulence. So it's not that 90% had symptoms, it's just that loads of people had a bit of gas, which we all do during the day anyway, at some point, probably. So that's where I think that needs considering as well, is that, look, we want to avoid anything if possible. Of course, we all want that perfect race, that everything goes well, that with no issues with injuries or fatigue. But the reality that I think if some athletes go in with the mindset of, I could experience this as a mild problem, and you go in almost expecting it, that would, I think, in some cases help as well a little bit.
Oh, that's so brilliant. So the analogy that I've got in my head right now is from a training perspective, there's always a gap, right? There's always a gap between the amount of training you can do during any training phase, no matter how perfect it is, and the physical resources that you need during the race. And what we try to do with smart training is we try to get that gap as narrow as possible, but there's always a gap. And so that gap manifests in the difficulty of the race, right? There is some struggle, right, during the course of a race. Sometimes it's late, sometimes it's early, sometimes it's the middle, sometimes it's the whole thing, but there is some sort of struggle, which is representative of that gap. It's the same thing on the GI perspective. Like, expect there to be a little bit of a gap between how well you can be prepared and what the race is actually going to demand of you come race day. And so when you do have the symptoms of 1 out of 10, it's not so surprising. You're like, yeah, this is part of the deal. This is part of the job, right?
Yeah. Like I said, so we obviously want to avoid the ones that make us pull out, and the GI symptoms are often the leading or the second leading cause for non-finishing or underperformance. But yeah, I think going in with the expectation of something is probably going to happen. They said it's. I've definitely had athletes running 100 milers and then be surprised that at some point they needed to go to the toilet. And so, well, you're pretty much out all
Yeah.
day. But you
Yeah,
go to the toilet
exactly.
every day normally. So why did you not think that there was going to be something special about this day that you just weren't going to go? And I think if you, like you said, expect it, minimize the risk of something more severe, something worse, then that's a good place to go for a lot of people.
That you need to edit the paper and submit something after the fact, and that's just athlete expectations, right? I'll take credit for that if you do get that submission. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the low FODMAP diet. It's miraculous for some, it's a nothing burger for others, and it can be problematic to implement, but something certainly worth doing. And I would recommend the athletes that are out there that are considering this as more of a long-term intervention to work with a registered dietitian or nutritionist with this, because they can help guide that energy balance process.
100%. Like I said, with a lot of the things that we can do, often they're not simple, but they're much simpler compared to the FODMAP stuff. Let's say if we want to, and what we'll go on to now, take a probiotic, it's okay, I take this pill or I don't. If you change your carbohydrate strategy during a race, it's okay, I'm just fine tuning the amounts and the volume that I'm taking. With a low FODMAP diet, like you said, all of a sudden you're looking at a complete upheaval of your diet, potentially. So that's something that needs a good sit down, a good conversation, and lots of deep thought and planning.
Okay, so we started out with the most complex one. We're going to kind of go from complex to simple. Maybe it's simple. So the next one is gut training. And to set this up a little bit, there's this great I don't know if it's great anymore, but there's this subheader in the book that I wrote, and it just says your stomach is made of muscle too. And the point that I was trying to make with that is most people think of muscle as skeletal muscle. And they go and they do a bicep curl and their biceps get bigger, right? Because it's skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle adapts. And so by presenting the stomach as a muscle too, what the argument that I was trying to set up is that it can adapt to stress in a similar way, not the exact same way, but in a similar way to skeletal muscle. and this is kind of gone, this is an area that's gone back and forth in the research as well. We tend to trivialize it from a coaching and a training perspective, to say, oh, just practice your race day nutrition. But now there's some research out there that says, well, based on an overload principle, you may be able to get superior adaptations with overloading the system just in a way that you would do training, right? You overload and then you or in a similar way as you would do training. So you covered this in the paper, and there's definitely, it's probably going to end up being just as ambiguous as the low FODMAP diet. So Jamie,
Well,
why don't you take us through what you guys found out when reviewing the research?
it's because again, it's one of those that a lot of coaches and athletes discuss this. We know this. We have conversations about it. We go to the literature, and there's one study that has only really looked at this. That there's another one that I can talk about, and in that study, it's a really great methodological study. It's a really good proof of principle. But what they got the athletes to do was run for an hour every day, consuming 90 grams an hour of carbohydrates during every single run. So it's 10 runs over 2 weeks, which I'll leave it up to other people, but how practical that is, how many people are going to do that. Whereas a more traditional approach might be, okay, I do my long runs or I do my back-to-back runs on the weekend. We'll start there, and at some point we might add a couple more training sessions in a week. So that paper was good in that the proof of principle of showing that your intestines can adapt. So that you said you need transport proteins to take that carbohydrate from the lumen of the intestine and almost let it come across into circulation. Though the number of those transport proteins aren't fixed, and where they are in the cell aren't fixed, so we can get more transporters and we can have more of them at the surface where they're needed. So that paper was really good, and it showed a reduction in malabsorption of the carbohydrates. But to translate that now to your athlete, as you said, is difficult. If we start higher up in the stomach, there's a really nice paper that again showed that only over 5 days, if you consume a huge amount of water, I think it's close to 2 liters an hour, you can very, very, like by a small amount, increase the rate of gastric emptying, which for when you think you're taking on nearly 2 liters an hour isn't great, it wasn't a huge finding, but what they also found is that people could just tolerate it better. So the perception of fullness was actually reduced a little bit during that study. So those are the two main studies in this area. Everything else is just experience and hearsay, essentially,
Right.
which, like you said, it makes things difficult. Where do you go from that? And where you put that in your season, where you put that in your training phase, is difficult. There's cell culture models, and we know these sorts of things. Like, we know this adaptation can happen, but the science behind how best to do this is pretty low. The other place there's good research is showing that just in general, if you ask people in studies, do you consume carbohydrates during training usually, and then when you compare at the end of a race who had symptoms and who didn't, those who consumed carbohydrates in their training tend to have. So it's nice evidence that some of what we do in the real world works, but maybe doesn't mean it's perfect in how we do it.
Yeah, and I'm kind of laughing here because it's almost cliche that we say these things like, oh, you need to try your race day nutrition program, and like you said, a lot of this is just the experience that we know that we shouldn't be incorporating new things on race day, and we should have some degree of familiarity with our nutrition program on race day. But when I come back to this, I kind of, like, my coaching background is heavily rooted in interval training, and when we talk about interval training, one of the things that we try to get one of the things that we try to get the best fix on is what is the dose that is necessary to achieve the right response. So you want a VO2 max bump, right? We know with a reasonable degree of certainty that you need a certain amount of time at a certain intensity exposure to bump up VO2 max. And you can go up and down the intensity spectrum, and you can kind of get good fixes on this. You need, 10 minutes at 90% of your VO2 max, or an hour at 85% of your VO2 max, or whatever. I look at this nutrition thing through the same lens, and I can't come up with that precise of an answer.
No, because like I said, that if that Australian study is the sort of, okay, we know this works if we hammer the system, if we do this nearly every day for 2 weeks. But that's almost unrealistic for athletes. And
Yeah.
like I said, that's without even taking into account any dental issues that might come along with just consuming that much. Like, which is, like you said, we have to put the whole athlete health, even the cost of it, the cost of doing that. When you look at some of the new hydrogel mixes and all these things, that they're not cheap. If you want to go and run and consume 90 grams an hour,
It's a
all the
$20 run. All of a sudden, it's a $20
every
run.
run is starting to cost you money. So it's like I said, so that's the start point. Great. Here's our proof of principle. Like exactly like you said. Now, if we try and think, well, what's the dose? If we start, so, and again, I can only speak from my experience and what we've used to some of our athletes, and it means that we start really early in the process. So we might be off season, do what you like, you enjoy your runs. If you're thirsty, if it's hot, have a drink. But once we're in a specific training phase, okay, we're going to now, just like your training load might increase, we'll increase your nutrition load during some of those runs. And I said it might start out that weeks 1 to 3, we only do this on your Sunday or your weekend long runs, and it might be 30 grams an hour in a given volume of fluid. Weeks 4 to 8, that increases every single week, and we're also going to throw that into a midweek, mid-long run if you've got that in your program. Then 2 weeks out, okay, we're going to do it almost just to try and mimic some of what we see in that paper. We do at least one of the interval sessions, because that's often the one that might mimic some race pace or mimic some of the harder intensities that you'll no doubt get during a race. So whether that be because you're hill climbing or there's the surge in pace, and we'll still also then do it in your mid-long run and your long runs on the weekend. But that's, like I said, that's a all of a sudden that's a really complicated, detailed program to include, and it's costly, and that's assuming that at no point during it does the athlete decide, well, do you know what, this particular brand or this particular ratio of carbohydrates or particular food intake doesn't suit me anymore. I want to experiment with a new one.
So you mentioned one thing that I think is really interesting is these adaptations are surely have some sort of transient nature to them, right? They come and they go, and we don't know what that rate is. And if I use my interval training analogy, we know detraining rates pretty well. Like, you remove training stimulus and we can plot out on a curve what happens to VO2 max, what happens to lactate threshold, what happens to muscular strength. And we, like I said, there's been enough experimentation there that we can get a realistic fix on this. We don't know this in this area. Here's how I've honestly like alchemized it. And it's very similar to what you do with your athletes is 8 weeks before the race, twice a week, you're doing your race day nutrition program, period. And I just keep it that simple.
Yeah, and I always try and include as well, you either have your B races throughout that time where you're not just going to do your in race, but you need to practice exactly what you think you're going to eat the day before, because it's no good thinking,
Yeah.
okay, I've got my nutrition down, but you didn't even think about the food you're going to eat the day before. So it's almost, okay, we need that entire routine, even if the volumes aren't exactly the same, because of course you're going to load up much more to do your 50 mile or your 100 mile, wherever it's going to be. But if you've got a big weekend, at least one of those weekends, 2 of those weekends, you now need to think about and replicate and get that plan, write it down, make comments afterwards, what felt good, what didn't feel good. Exactly as you said you would do with the actual run training.
Yeah, I agree with that run a show thing, whether you're using a long run or a B race or whatever. But I've just found through experience that 8 weeks, twice a week, full race day program, I feel, yeah, scientists hate these statements, but I feel that is the right dose for some reasonable GI response. In addition to that, it's enough frequency that the athlete just gets used to, hey, this is the stuff I'm going to take in on race day. And the final thing is it allows enough time and enough frequency just to get into the routine and take the thinking out
Yeah.
of what is my race day routine going to be. So like all like the physiology, the practical, the psychology side all kind of align up with that one frequency. Is 3 days a week, better, or is it 9 weeks versus that, who knows? I'm not going to split that hair that finely, but I think
No,
that's roughly enough dose and enough frequency to create a reasonable response, and then you line it up with all the other practical elements. I just think it's it's in the I'm not going to say I'm right, but it's at least in the ballpark.
yeah. Well, the one thing we know is that as well, if you're not experimenting with something that is less well studied, so if you're not thinking of taking, I don't know, ketone esters or medium chain triglycerides or amino acid, if you're not thinking of taking these things and your fueling is mostly carbohydrate, which I'll leave to you to discuss on some of your other show. But if that's what your strategy is, you can adapt the carbohydrate transporters just through your normal diet anyway. So
Yeah.
if you have a higher carbohydrate diet, like you said, that's like the almost residual training that's going on in the background. So if you don't restrict that in your habitual diet, it's like you're going to have that constant load added, and these training runs where you're adding on the exercise stuff can be exactly like you said, as much about the adaptation of the gut as it is the psychological side of things, the practice, the repetition, all of those other things that they said beyond just training the gut.
Yeah, I don't think you touched on this in this paper, but I talked about this in a previous podcast with Patrick Wilson, that a lot of the GI issues happen with people who have had previous GI issues.
Yeah.
And there's a physiological component to that, absolutely. But there is also a psychological component to that too. If they've
Yeah.
experienced it before and they know it's at a certain mile marker, at a certain temperature, or kind of whatever, that anxiety that is already enhanced throughout the process, just because of doing a race, that anxiety that, oh shit, literally, I'm at this, I'm at mile 50 of 100 and I always have these GI issues above 80 degrees or at mile 50 or whatever. That creates another like compounding factor that can fuel a lot of this GI distress.
And that maybe leads on one of the things that we threw in the paper that we had, there's no exercise evidence therefore, was this link between the gut and the brain and some of the neurotransmitters, some of the hormones that can play a role, because we know from other clinical models, that all of these things can even affect the visceral sensation of pain. So as like you said, so then, and this is why you might then see differences between athletes, because you could have two athletes with the same diet, the same training, the same everything at prep, but if one of them is stressed, then that leads to some underlying physiological or neurological change. That might just mean that, so not to say that it's all in there, it's not something that is all in their head, but their physiology is physically making that stress more painful to them than another athlete. And so we put that in the paper, even though it's really short and there's no great substance to it. Before that, because we want to stimulate this conversation and make people aware of these things and see how can we study this in future.
Well, and going back to my, twice a week for 8 weeks. A lot of times, what I'll do when I start that process with athletes who have like this routine, or they show a pattern of GI distress during really specific parts. We try to work through those really specific parts as much as you can, or as much as you can have an equivalent during the training process, so that they get some reasonable degree of confidence that they can get there. And it might not be zero, but it's at least, maybe one, as opposed to 4, 5, or 6, which they were experiencing earlier.
And that is something that with all the people I've consulted for, is almost something I say to everyone at baseline, like, don't expect us to completely alleviate your symptoms.
Right.
Let's just look for improvement. And if you
Yep.
look for improvement, then you're on to winning. Your performances will be better.
I love that. I love that. Okay, so we're going to go into the third one in terms of simplicity of implementation. I just came up with that. and I think that these are the things that people are naturally really interested in, because it's the easiest solution to implement and everybody wants potions and pills to, solve problems. but there can be some, reasonable degree of improvement that we can expect from this last category, which you guys touch on a lot in the paper. I think there's a lot of verbiage that's taken up with this last category, and that is probiotics. This is another one of those hot areas. It seemed like it was hotter like 2 or 3 years ago, and now it's starting to die down. Where every
Prebiotics and things like that are starting to take over. Definitely, the fermented foods is one that the army is coming. Definitely.
fermented food. So you took a lot of time. You took a lot of time in the paper to describe how probiotics might actually help the situation. Let's run through that part now.
I don't know. I hope this is because of my bias in that I think two of my papers are cited in there. But yeah, it's as you said, it's the simplest to implement in that you take a pill, you don't take a pill. There's maybe a decision to be made about finding the one that you might use, and that's where for this category the complexity and the difficulty comes in because, like you said, let's face it, there are loads. There are so many. It's a multi-billion
Right.
pound industry now worldwide when you look at it, and it's been growing for the last 10 plus years, and it's still growing this year. As a consumer then when you're faced with all this choice and you're also like screamed at about how it's strain specific, every probiotic is different, and so you can sit there and you feel, well, how do I know which one to choose? Because there's no great resource that says this is the one that reduces symptoms for athletes, or this is the one that reduces traveler's diarrhea, or this is the one that's really good for immune function. You're just left to your own devices. And I feel so guilty. This is something that, because of my research, I've been invited on podcasts or given webinars on so many times. And I feel guilty because I can't give a much better thing than that, better advice than that. Like, other than, okay, well, you need to do a little bit of research. Or if one doesn't work, maybe it's because not all probiotics are useless, but maybe that one just didn't have the ability to do what you wanted. So yeah, so there's in this area, there's a little bit more research. Some of it has found no benefits whatsoever, and I approached that. So I went back to some of that literature and I started to have a look, and not to overly criticize it, but in some of those papers, the probiotics were almost destined to fail because, exactly like I've said with my athletes, to have been beneficial, they needed to like completely eliminate symptoms. So the authors in some papers have found how many athletes had symptoms, for example, and there were then no difference between probiotics and placebo. But that's the level at which they researched, not, okay, these athletes had an average severity of this much. Did it even get better slightly? So some of those papers, I think we touched upon in the paper, were destined to fail because if someone has GI issues, they have a long history of GI issues, like you see it in IBS patients, you're often looking for improvement, not complete elimination. Some of the others then that moved upon which I try to base the design of some of my studies then did start to look at things like, okay, let's have a look how many days a week, for example, or in a given month, how many times does a runner or an athlete experience problems or experience a symptom? What does that severity look like? How many times do they have a moderate or severe symptom? And papers that have tended to look at those type of measures have found differences in a few different probiotics. So the scientist in me definitely says that all of them are different, but a lot of them can still do the same thing. So a lot of them can change make some small change to the microbiome. A lot of them can block pathogens in or compete with pathogens in the intestine. So yeah, the efficacy of them could be different, but in general, it's not a bad place to start. If you want to be super detailed, there are ones that have got a little bit more research than others. So in two of our papers now that we've shown that with our marathon runners, they tend to report about 1 or 2 days a week where they have a moderate or a serious GI issue during a run. It tends to be about 1 every 10 days, and we found about a halving of that incidence. And then the number of moderate symptoms was about halved as well. And we've replicated that. So we did it with our track marathon study where we was all really tightly controlled, and we've replicated that in a bigger mass participation race as well. Very similar findings, and we no difference in the placebo group.
And in those, what was the specific intervention or supplementation parameters, I guess, that you were using in those cohorts?
So we used one that is, again, it's similar to a lot of other ones that you'll see. So it was 25 billion colony forming units, which is in the sort of ballpark for most capsule-based probiotics. With the four different strains, two of them are lactobacillus, two of them were bifidobacterium. Again, something that's not too uncommon. What we haven't done and what many of us haven't done, and I've written and almost criticized, is that we didn't compare this one to another one. Because it's difficult. The more arms you add to a study, the lower statistical power, the lower chances you have of finding anything. So I think we are getting to that point where more funding is needed, because it's no longer good enough to say, okay, is a probiotic better than nothing? We know that if we design the study well enough, there are some improvements in, again, some athletes. It's not a cure-all. By no, I don't want to come across as if I'm saying, okay,
Yeah.
you get everything that we just said, all of those are really complicated, just throw a probiotic at it. It's not, because even in our cohort of athletes in both studies, you still have athletes on a probiotic and they still have a lot of symptoms and a lot of moderate symptoms or a lot of severe symptoms. So it's not a cure-all. You can't just throw a tablet at it and make it go away.
Well, not only is it not a cure-all, but and that kind of fits the theme that we were talking about earlier, right? We're not looking to eliminate all symptoms. We're just trying to move down the incident scale or the perceived exertion scale, so to speak, with any of these things. Is there, though, when we talk about any type of supplementation, usually there's a minimum effective dose associated with that. We talk about that with caffeine a lot, and a whole host of supplements that athletes use. Is that still, do you think, this might be I think statement again, do you think that is going to be the case on the probiotic side as well?
I think so. And I think that's why fermented foods are going to be seen to be beneficial. I'm almost sure of it. There is enough potential there for how they can improve our overall health. What I don't think they'll be able to do is substitute for some of the times we want to use a probiotic, like these specific circumstances, because probiotics are in the tens of billions of bacteria. Fermented foods can be in the millions or hundreds of millions. So you're talking between 10 and 100 factor difference. So I do think there's going to be this minimal dose, and it probably is in that billions range, where then what the difference might be. I always present this slide that shows the one end you have the fermented yogurt drinks that people will know, the really popular one that when people know that I do probiotic research, they think that there's only this one that they all get. And that's the sort of, so everyone knows that. And that's normally, so they sell a range that is about 9 billion. On the very opposite end, you can get ones that are sometimes pharmacologically prescribed, but they are commercially available, that have got 450 billion. So it's even within commercial products, you've got a 50 factor difference between the lowest and the highest that you can buy. The number of species, again, is different. And like I said, the Yakults and things, you often have one strain, one species. Some products have 15. I've seen ones with 25 different species. I don't know if a lot of that is just for marketing, because it's okay, if some is good, more must be better. But we often don't know, okay, well, which one of those might be the one that works, which
Right.
one of those will be beneficial for this type of thing. So that comes back to what I said at the start. For a consumer, then you're sat there and you go, okay, this is my A race. I want to get everything right. Is it enough to just buy the simple capsule that Jamie's using in his study, or the fermented yogurt? This is like super mega dosed. Should I invest all my money and just like cover all bases and just go on this one here, 450 billion a day? And no one knows if that is going to be any better to this at all, or it could even be worse.
So what's the reasonable starting point there? We
I
presented
always
this whole landscape of, this
and
many
it's
billion colony
so I'm
forming
gonna
units to 50x that. Like, where's the reasonable, like, if somebody's looking at this going, okay, I understand that it's not going to be a night and day difference. This is an intervention that I want to try because these GI issues are hindering my performance in some way. I think that using a probiotic supplementation is a reasonable thing for me. It's relatively cost effective. It's easy to implement. Where's the starting point for people in terms of the types of products that they can use, and then the duration that they need to experience that product with before they can see some sort of reasonable improvement?
Definitely. Let's take the science hat off first. And if
Yeah,
anybody
yeah, yeah.
assumes something why I say different, it's because from a science, but yeah, from a practical point of view, something that is in that region of 20 to 30 billion colony forming units has multiple strains or species. Again, between 3 to 5 is probably the most that you want, because then it means each of those individual species will be in there in enough. Because they said if you had more, but only one of them is effective, it means that yes, you've got 10 strains, but the one that you really need is really low in total amount. So the good thing is there are lots of those different types of products. I think as a very minimum, you need to try and give it 2 weeks. We've never seen this in any of our studies, but there are a small number that show an increase in symptoms in the first 2 weeks. So maybe that's just if there's maybe some small change in the microbiome. Maybe it's that now you've got a slight increase in some of the bacteria that can ferment foods a little bit. So, like I said, we've never seen it, and lots of other studies don't report it. But I do think you need to give it at least 2 weeks, because you may see a small increase in symptoms, and that's the point that if you've got a history of symptoms, you would go, oh no, this isn't for me.
Right.
But for some people, there is an adaptive period. So if you go at least 2 weeks, and like I said, all of our studies, we found differences in just 4 weeks. So in our marathon paper, we found that even after 2 weeks, there was a beginning of reduction in symptoms. When we gave marathon runners a probiotic 4 weeks before a marathon race, and again, we replicated this in a big city marathon. The runners who had taken the probiotic also had lower severity symptoms during the race itself. So during the marathon race. In our track marathon, because we could obviously ask them almost every other lap, every like the 105 and a bit laps that they ran the athletics track, it was specifically in that final third of the race that the marathon runners' symptoms were less severe. So they increased a little bit, but once they got into that final third, it was just stabilized. So exactly like we said, the point you want to be might be mildly uncomfortable, but the pace doesn't drop. They can live with it. Whereas in our placebo group, we had a couple of athletes really start to slow down and with some really bad stomach cramping.
I like, we can put a pin in it there because we've got these 3 interventions and we've got practical recommendations for all of them. Let's kind of run through them and kind of recap it for the audience here. So the broad umbrella is, with any of these interventions, it's reasonable to expect some degree of relief, but getting to zero, meaning no issues, especially in an ultramarathon situation, is probably unlikely. So I'd say to even start out with, make sure that your expectations are adjusted accordingly. That's a big part out of all this, right?
Huge, definitely.
Okay, so the first one is low FODMAP diet, and when when athletes are interested in this, I almost immediately kick it over to the registered dietitians to try to do this. That's a long-term proposition. There's some evidence that this could work. There's a lot of anecdotal tales of it was miraculous for me, or I had some sort of mild symptom reductions and things like that. But that's the complicated scenario, because you're kind of turning over your entire diet. You're like upheaving your entire diet, correct?
100%. And like I said, without going down another rabbit hole into a complete other topic, I'd say a simpler starting point for most athletes is to just look at the diet. So not from a FODMAP point of view, but from just there are other practical things they can look at first in terms of what they're eating and when they're eating around a race. So if that's your starting point, looking at that pre-race diet, so the 24 to 48 hours before, there are probably other things that will immediately stand out that if you just change that, rather than, like you said, completely change the entire diet. But certainly, if that's then the route people want to go down, the low FODMAP, registered dietitian, good, solid, well-researched advice and support as well, because I think it's such a big thing. It's probably too big of an issue to just tackle on your own and keep yourself honest and accountable with it.
100%. So then there's gut training. And I think the recommendations we kind of batted around. I'm laughing because it's just we're just making stuff up. Um, they're reasonably educated guesses, but at the end of the day, that's about as good as you can get. A few days a week for several weeks, you're doing
Yeah.
your race day nutrition plan. I think that that's reasonable. It's practically implementable, and from a science perspective, there's reasonable evidence to suggest that that has a degree of efficacy to it.
And even if, like you said, even if we said we could find a study that eventually says, well, the minimum dose showed that you maybe only needed to do this in your last long run before the race, why would you leave it until then? Why would you not
Yeah.
start thinking about this 8 weeks out? So even if you don't need 8 weeks from a adaptation and like I said, a training point of view, you want as much time as possible to figure things out and get things wrong, change your mind. You might abandon a run halfway through because you do need to run to the toilet. So, for beyond just the physiological point of view, you should be starting with a reasonable amount of time before.
Okay, so that's the gut training piece of it. Few days a week, several weeks beforehand,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe a super gut trial to test like tolerance limits or some sort of new food or things like that. Those are one-off situations. And then the last thing on the probiotics, and you're the expert here, so you're gonna have to correct my dose and timing on this if I misremembered it. But it's in the tens of billions of colony forming units that you're taking a supplement, of which you have 3 to 5 strands for 4 weeks leading up to the race.
yeah, at least. And it is one of those things that I said it's probiotics can be almost one of those lifestyle supplements. So people will maybe take them over the winter period, and it seems that they are transient in that if you stop taking them within a few weeks, all of those bacteria that you were putting in seem to disappear. So it's not that you have to take them every day, but like I said, it's not something that you can think, okay, well, I'll take it 6 months out for a few months before the race, and it doesn't matter if I stop beforehand. So as a minimum dose, yeah, 4 weeks before a race. Um, and it's the same thing as your budget affords and where that ranks on your priority list of what you want to spend your money on leading to a race. And I don't want to tell people to spend their money on that rather than coaching or physio or massage or anything else, because like I said, unless you're a sponsored athlete, all these things come at a cost, and I think you need to think, is that the best avenue for my money?
I mean, that's actually the best point to leave it on. If I put my coaching hat on, which is the hat that I wear almost all the time, I start with 2, which is the gut training, make sure you know your
Yeah,
race day routine, and then I go to the probiotic side, and then I go to low FODMAP diet. That's the
as
way that I would kind of rank order those interventions.
I'm genuinely now exactly the same from all of my experience, and I found that 90 to 95% of athletes, I only need to look at that
Yep.
second point. I
I'm
can
with
think,
you there.
I can think of
It's the
most.
But it's the 5% that it makes me pull my hair out, and those are the athletes that pull their own hair out, right? I mean, you have enough experience working with athletes that there is it's a small cohort, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10% or whatever. There's a small cohort that you just have to throw all the interventions out, and you're just trying to completely problem solve to get them from a 9 or a 10 on that 1 to 10 scale down to something that's manageable, which might be 4. And I mean, that becomes the performance limiter for those athletes for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it's again, I think it's something we touched on early in the paper. It's for me, it's the realization that sometimes that the more recreational athletes we work with, just by chance, the more that we'll work with someone who has undiagnosed IBS, somebody who has an undiagnosed, and so there, like you said, that 5% is way more difficult, and like I said, and could even, and I've had 2 scenarios where it's eventually even needed clinical follow up because it's
Yeah.
just they could live with it, but it was almost that exercise physical challenge that started to reveal what was an underlying pathology.
Yep. And sometimes that, I mean, just like training, sometimes you need advanced interventions to create the
Yeah,
adaptation. It's the same thing here.
yeah, definitely.
All right, that's a brilliant place to leave it. Do you have any final thoughts on this incredibly complex issue? And I do think, I can't promise this right here right now, but I do think that in sequence, the next podcast that is going to be released is with your colleague Kyle, who's the lead
That'd be
author of
good.
this paper. So it's going to be another follow up.
As
We'll
and I'm
make sure to
sure,
hit on different angles of this for
as
sure.
I said, I'm sure because of obviously we came together because we all had slight different interests and angles for it. I'm sure Kat will bring something completely different as well and a new approach to this. And no, this has been awesome. This has almost been like a bit of a dream for the last few months. So thank you so much for coming up, for letting me come on. To come on podcast that you actually listen to is pretty cool.
Well, thank you for coming on. It's always good to weave in people who are in the scientific community that also directly work with athletes on a consistent basis like you do, because you bring the practical element of all of this science, and you can say, well, I studied all this stuff and I knew all about this, but here's how we throw most of it out
Really
the
good.
window and take the one sliver of what I do know. You do that brilliant, Jamie, and that's one of the reasons I appreciate you out in the field.
Um,
Good luck at Kona. That's going to
Thank
be
you
fun.
so
Good
much.
luck getting into the US.
Been through some from South America, so thank you so much. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah,
Speak.
I appreciate it a lot, man. All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Jamie for coming on the podcast today. Next week, we are going to have Jamie's colleague and the lead author of the paper that we were discussing, Kyle Smith, to come on the podcast as a follow-up to this conversation. I cannot wait for that. Expect more practical insights and a little bit more of a deep science dive into why we experience these GI issues and what are the different pathways out of there. I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of the listeners out there. As you all know, there are no sponsors or no endorsers of this podcast. The best thing that you can do to help the podcast out is just to spread the love and spread the word to your friends. I really appreciate it when I see people sharing this podcast out there on social media. It just makes my heart line up. So I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.